now. We did that in December 11. But as I was saying, every analysis is done retrospectively. So just in, I think it was March, or maybe the beginning of March, the EU Silk report came out, and that backs up what we knew in our hearts. But that's 2 years later. The press have moved on. We've issued a press release based on the facts, but nobody's interested. That's 2 years old. That's old news. So that's the problem, and that's why we need equality budgeting going forward rather than looking backwards. So in December 2011, or Budget 2012, these are the things that happened to lone parents financially. These are just the financial things. There was, if you were on rent supplement or rent allowance, you were to pay €312 extra a year towards the rent. Your fuel allowance was cut by €120 a year. €120 a year. If you were availing of back-to-school footwear and clothing allowance, that was cut by €50 for primary school children, €55 a year for secondary school children. If you were working part-time, there's something called the income disregard, which I'll go into in more detail in a few moments, but that the effects on the income disregard meant a €416 a year loss to that. And then if you were on a CE scheme, you lost €1,549.60 per child if you want a CE scheme. So the cuts were very brutal. You know, we were on poverty levels and those cuts all came in and they were awful. But what was worse than that was the options available to get out of poverty for us. They closed in. Because prior to that, if we wanted to get back into work, we could do a CE scheme. After Budget 2012, we were allowed to do CE schemes, but instead of getting paid for them, we were now given €20 a week to do 19.5 hours work with no childcare. So the €20 might pay you a bus fare to your job, but it's certainly not going to get you childcare. So effectively, CE schemes were ruled out for lone parents. We were allowed to do VEC and FOSS courses before that, because if you did a VEC course or if you did a FOSS course, you got your free childcare. After that, they introduced, in Budget 2012, they introduced, no, you still get subsidised childcare, it's €25 a week. €25 a week for childcare does sound very reasonable, and I'm sure there are working parents here in the room who think, wow, I'd love to pay €25 a week for childcare. But the problem is, as a lone parent, you get the basic social welfare rate of €188. You get $29.80 a week for your child. That's what you have for the week for the child. If you pay €25 towards the childcare, you have $4.80 a week to feed and clothe your child. So in effect, you cannot afford to pay €25 for childcare. So that was it. FOSS and VEC courses were out of it. So we felt all the avenues were closing. We were caught in the home. The normal avenues back into work, which would have been doing a CE scheme, doing a FOSS course, they were all closed off. And that was bad. And you're thinking, Jesus, that is bad. But on top of that, they have introduced a new thing as well, which meant that when your youngest child reaches age 7, you were to either give up your part-time job and go on the dole, or else work full-time. There was no more alternative of the part-time job once your youngest child reaches 7. So what we were saying was, really, from 0 to 7, the supports to get us back into work, you know, the FOSS courses, the VEC courses, all of those things that would have got us work ready. If they had even done that change and said, right, we're going to throw resources at children, the parents, until the child reaches age 7, and so they're fully ready to go into the workforce. No, they didn't. They pulled every support away from us. They left us stuck in the home, and then once the child reaches age 7, there you go, compete in an open market and get a full-time job. And if you can't do that, you're on the dole for life. It's enforced poverty for children. It's enforced poverty for parents, and the longer you stay out of the workforce, the harder it is to get back into it. That's fact. Your confidence, everything goes. One of the major things that we found we've had a problem with as well was none of these changes had any effect on lone parents who weren't working, who weren't studying, or who didn't want to do it. And yet it was being portrayed as this is an encouragement to get you back into the market. It's an encouragement, and that's how they got away with it in the press. Well, those lone parents sitting at home doing nothing, you know, we have to encourage them to do it. But it only attacked lone parents who were in part-time jobs or lone parents who were trying to study. It didn't affect people who were always going to be on social welfare. So it was an anomaly there anyway. one of the things Labour did back in 1997, which was a great, I think I'll stand up because I can see people try. One of the things Labour did in 1997, which was a great initiative, was they looked at lone parents and said, we need to get lone parents back into the market. And they introduced this thing called income disregard. And the income disregard meant that you were allowed to earn a certain amount of money before your benefits were touched. And that was to encourage women to get back into the workforce while their children went to school, and to start it so that by the time the children did get to 12 or 13 and they felt safe, they could go full-time into a job. And it was a great success. They brought in, it was 146.70 or 146.50, something like that, but it was back in 1997. Throughout the Celtic Tigers, as we know, and that 146 was to take into account that you were going to have to get childcare, you were going to have to pay expenses, so you were able to earn this €146 without making any allowances. You know, your allowances weren't going to be affected, and it had a great effect. In fact, when Minister Burton took over, 60% of lone parents were in part-time jobs, the other 20% were in training or education. There was only 20% at home, and in general they were the 20% whose children were far too young or there were special needs or whatever. So it had a great effect, and that was from 1997 to 2011. That income disregard never increased. It didn't take into account cost of living increases, cost of childcare increases. It stayed stable. So in effect, each year and year with inflation, it was being decreased or whatever. So in budget 2012, which December 11, you think, great, they're going to do something with it. They did. They really did do something with it. They reduced it. They reduced it year on year to the fact that by 2015, the income disregard will be €60. So it'll be a decrease of 80 odd euro a week, which is in effect, you know, because of the way the benefits work, will be about €50 down for a lone parent who's trying to work part-time. It's going to mean that really, in fact, a lot of them won't be able to keep it up. So even people who are now in a lone parent job are going to be forced out of the job market because there will be no money for their childcare. So our issue was we were being forced into the house, there were no supplies, and then at 7 we would compete in an open market. And it's too impossible, there's no childcare, whatever, and we were saying we're going to be forced into it. How did they get away with that? Well, one, because there is no equality budget analysis beforehand. There's no facts to know what's going on. So that's how they got away with it. But there is also this little trickle of misinformation that's fed by the government to the general public. And you know, we were all very saddened when we heard about Magdalene Laundries, and everybody's shocked, and how could we treat people like that? Well, the attitude that lone parents are somehow the unworthy poor still exists. It's not that, you know, we're not forced into the Magdalene homes now, but we're forced into living with our children in poverty. And I have the facts to prove it, and I'll go through them with you in a minute. But that attitude prevailed. I want to talk to you about two of our politicians, what they said. You know, and this is the information that's dripping down in the media. Derek Keating in December, just gone, when the respite cuts, the carers' respite cut. They all know how angry I am about this. He turned around in the Dáil and he was justifying the respite, you know, saying it's awful that the respite carers grant was cut, disgraceful, whatever. And then out of nowhere, he said, it's lone parents. It's I've met lone parents and they've 2 kids and 3 kids from different fathers and this, and you know, because of that type of unworthy people, we're having to cut people like you. That came from a government TD, and that's the information that comes through. And we'll go through, is that factually correct? But that's what the attitude was. Joan Burton last year, when we were going through our 7 is Too Young campaign, and it was actually this time last April, you know, she stood up in the Dáil, and there was an awful case at the time of a Romanian girl who had gone missing. She was 16 and she had 2 children, a 2-year-old and an 11-month-old. And Joan Burton stood up and said, in the Dáil, during the debate, said, well, you know, now you see why I'm trying to do these changes for lone parents, and we can't have these uneducated young people, you know. Do you want to know the facts? Do you know how many people, back in 1997, 4.4% of lone parents were teenagers in 1997. Nowadays, it's 1.5% in 2010. 1.5, so this Romanian woman that she was using as an example of why she needed to reform lone parents, it represents 1.5% of lone parents. Was it a gender attack? Is that why we need to do gender analysis? I leave that decision up to you. But 98% of recipients of one-parent family are women. So no, I don't know whether it was an attack on women or not, but 98% of them are women. The number of one-parent family recipients who are over 30 is 65%. So if you look at that, there are women who are basically in relationships broke down. Our family court system is a nightmare, and it's very hard to get maintenance. The court system, there is no compliance with it, it's very hard to get it, and a lot of the women are resorting to one-parent family. You want to change the system, that's fine, change the system, but force the absent parent to pay their share, not force the children and their mothers to live in poverty, because that's what happened with that. So that's why, with quality budgeting, I said to you I'd come back to the actual facts of what happened. In 2012, or December 11, budget 2012, we were shell-shocked as lone parents. We couldn't understand what was happening. The facts came out of what was going on in the country. That's, as I said, the EU Survey of Income and Living Conditions, an EU report, nobody can debate it. Deprivation rates, where there's 2 or more forced deprivation of a person. The general public, 24.4% of people were suffering from deprivation rates in the general public in 2011. For unemployed people, it was 42.2%. For lone parents, bearing in mind 60% of them were working, 56% of them and their children suffered. That was the gravy train we were on. That's why we had to be cut in budget December 11. We were the poorest, but we only found out now. So our deprivation rates were 230% higher than that of the general public. Consistent poverty. The general population, 6.9% of people live in consistent poverty. For lone parents, 16.4%, 238% higher than the general public. That's the type of analysis that comes out after that was before the attacks were made on us. That was before. And that was the information that 2 years later we find out. So why do I want equality budgeting? Because I don't want that to happen to any other group again. Because I want to fight for lone parents, but I don't want it to be on the back of carers or somebody on disability grants or on any other sector. I don't want that. I want the analysis to be done beforehand. I want no other sector to go through that. And when the government stand up in the Dáil or stand on the week before politics or any other programme, and when they say it's a fair budget, I want to have the confidence to go, it's not nice, but it's fair. And we don't have it at the moment. So.
Thank you for that. Food for thought for everyone, I think. Following Louise now, we have Nat O'Connor from TASC. He's the Director of